What happens when a racist woman calls the cops on two innocent black boys, only to find out they're the mayor's kids? Buckle up, because this story is about to take a turn she never saw coming. Please, subscribe and support us. The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, draping the quiet neighborhood in a golden glow. Elmwood Park was alive with the sounds of children laughing, the rhythmic squeak of a swing set, and the occasional bark of a dog. It was the kind of place that looked peaceful at first glance. Rows of neatly trimmed hedges, towering oak trees, and benches where elderly folks exchanged gossip. But beneath that postcard-perfect charm, there were unspoken rules. Rules that didn't exist on paper, but in the minds of people like Karen Matthews. Karen sat on her front porch, her manicured nails tapping against the wooden railing as she sipped her iced tea. Her eyes, sharp and watchful, roamed the open field where children played. She considered herself the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood. If something was out of place, she made sure to set it right. And today something, or rather someone, was out of place. Two young black boys, Jamal, 10, and Malik, 7, were chasing a soccer ball across the soft green grass. Their laughter was light and free, their sneakers kicking up dust as they dribbled the ball between them. The game was simple, just a friendly match between brothers, but to Karen, it was a disturbance. Her jaw clenched as she stared at them. They weren't like the other kids, the ones whose parents waved at her in the mornings, whose little blonde and brown-haired heads bobbed around the playground without a care. No, these two were different. It wasn't the first time she had seen them. They had been around more lately, ever since that loud black woman, their grandmother, moved into the house down the block. Miss Loretta, or that woman with the attitude, as Karen called her in hushed tones during neighborhood meetings, had been taking care of them ever since their parents separated. Karen had been hoping their presence was temporary, but here they were again, running, laughing, playing, as if they belonged. She scowled, gripping her cup tighter. "Why do they have to play here?" She muttered under her breath. The thing that really got under her skin was that the park didn't even belong to her. It was public property, open to everyone. But she had convinced herself that some people just didn't fit in. And these boys? They were at the top of her list. Across the park, inside a cozy little house with lace curtains and the smell of warm cornbread drifting through the air, Miss Loretta sat in her favorite chair by the window. She had her Bible open on her lap, but her eyes weren't on the pages. Instead, she was watching her grandsons, a small smile on her lips. She loved those boys more than life itself. Malik, with his boundless energy and big, curious eyes, and Jamal, with his thoughtful nature and quiet determination. They were her pride and joy, the reason she got up every morning with strength in her bones. Raising them hadn't been easy, not with their father, her son, being so busy as the mayor of this city, and their mother out of the picture after the separation. She knew they missed their old life, their big house, their parents together under one roof. But she had promised them one thing. They were safe with her. She had no idea that promise was about to be tested. Karen, still fuming, pulled out her phone. She hesitated for just a moment, her finger hovering over the screen. Was she overreacting? No, they shouldn't be here. She pressed the numbers. 911, what's your emergency? Her voice was calm, but laced with authority. There are two suspicious black boys loitering near the park, she said, her lips curving in satisfaction. I don't know what they're up to, but they're making people uncomfortable. You might want to send someone before something happens. She didn't expect what would happen next. Amal had just faked left and sent the soccer ball rolling past Malik when he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. A woman standing on her porch, watching them. He knew that look. It wasn't the casual glance of a neighbor or the friendly nod from one of the parents who often brought their kids to the park. This was something else. A tight-lipped, narrowed-eye kind of stare. His stomach twisted. "Yo, Malik," he murmured, nudging his little brother. "Let's chill for a bit." Malik groaned, clearly not ready to stop playing. "Come on, man. I was about to score." But Jamal wasn't paying attention to the game anymore. His gaze flicked back to the woman on the porch, Karen Matthews. He had seen her before, heard Grandma Loretta grumble about her too. That woman got too much time on her hands, always worried about the wrong things. she had said once while baking biscuits. Jamal wasn't sure what Karen's problem was, but he knew one thing for sure: she didn't like them. And sure enough, she was dialing a number on her phone. His chest tightened. He wasn't stupid. He had seen the news. He knew what happened to black boys who made the wrong people uncomfortable. He didn't know all the words for it, but he knew enough. "Malik," he said again, this time with more urgency. "Come on, let's go home." Malik turned, confused, but when he followed Jamal's gaze and saw Karen staring them down, his little face fell. He might have been young, but even he understood what was happening. They didn't belong here, not in her eyes. Still, Malik was stubborn. "We didn't do nothing," he whispered. "I know," Jamal said, his hands balling into fists, "but that don't matter to her." From her porch, Karen smirked as she watched the boys freeze up. They knew. Good. She pressed the phone closer to her ear, speaking just loudly enough for them to hear. Yes, 2 young black males, acting suspicious. Jamal's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to run. Should they? His stomach twisted. "Yo, Malik," he murmured, nudging his little brother. "Let's chill for a bit." Malik groaned, clearly not ready to stop playing. "Come on, man. I was about to score." But Jamal wasn't paying attention to the game anymore. His gaze flicked back to the woman on the porch, Karen Matthews. He had seen her before. Heard Grandma Loretta grumble about her, too. That woman got too much time on her hands, always worried about the wrong things. She had said once while baking biscuits. Jamal wasn't sure what Karen's problem was, but he knew one thing for sure: she didn't like them. And sure enough, she was dialing a number on her phone. His chest tightened. He wasn't stupid. He had seen the news. He knew what happened to black boys who made the wrong people uncomfortable. He didn't know all the words for it, but he knew enough. "Malik," he said again, this time with more urgency. "Come on, let's go home." Malik turned, confused, but when he followed Jamal's gaze and saw Karen staring them down, his little face fell. He might have been young, but even he understood what was happening. They didn't belong here, not in her eyes. Still, Malik was stubborn. "We didn't do nothing," he whispered. "I know," Jamal said, his hands balling into fists, "but that don't matter to her." From her porch, Karen smirked as she watched the boys freeze up. They knew. Good. She pressed the phone closer to her ear, speaking just loudly enough for them to hear. Yes, 2 young black males, acting suspicious. Jamal's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to run. Should they run? No. Bad idea. Running made things worse. That's what Dad told him. Malik's voice wavered. "Jamal, what do we do?" Jamal exhaled slowly, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just stay cool." It was too late to leave now. The cops were coming. Across the street, inside their small house, Miss Loretta was still watching. She had been planning to call the boys inside for dinner, but something in the air didn't sit right with her. The way Jamal had stiffened, the way Malik's usual endless energy seemed to drain from his little body. Then she saw Karen on the phone. Her heart dropped. Loretta didn't need to hear the conversation to know what was happening. Her heart clenched. She knew what happened when white folks like Karen called the cops on little black boys. Without hesitating, she pushed open the screen door and called out, her voice urgent but steady. "Jamal, Malik, come inside, now." The boys immediately turned toward her, relief flickering across their faces. But before they could take a step, "You boys better stay put." Karen's voice rang out, sharp and commanding, making both of them freeze. Jamal turned slowly, his hands balling into fists at his sides. Karen had stepped off her porch now, standing at the edge of the park like she had the right to stop them. "You think you can just run off?" she sneered. "I don't think so. You're waiting for the police." Malik's lip trembled. Malik's lip trembled. "We didn't do nothing," he said, his voice small. Karen scoffed. "Oh, really? Then why do you look so guilty?" Her eyes darted to a nearby bench where some kids had left their backpacks and toys. "Who's to say you didn't take something that wasn't yours?" Jamal's fists clenched tighter. Miss Loretta had heard enough. She stormed down her porch steps, her eyes blazing. "Karen, you best move out of the way and let my grandbabies come home." Karen crossed her arms. "Well, somebody around here needs to teach these boys some respect." Loretta's voice dropped, low and dangerous. "And somebody needs to mind their damn business." Before Karen could respond, the distant wail of police sirens cut through the air. Malik flinched. Jamal's heart pounded. Loretta turned on her heel and rushed back into the house, grabbing her phone with shaking hands. She didn't call 911. She called her son. Charles Carter, the mayor. Mom? His voice was confused at first, but she cut him off. You better get down here, right now. Charles Carter sat behind his wide oak desk, his head buried in city reports when his phone buzzed. Mom? He frowned at the urgency in her voice. You better get down here, right now. His heart skipped a beat. His mother was a strong woman, tough as iron and never one to panic. For her to sound like this, something was wrong. What happened? It's the boys, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Karen Matthews called the cops on them. They weren't doing nothing but playing, and now she's got them trapped out there. A sharp, icy rage filled Charles's chest. Karen Matthews. The name alone sent a rush of anger through him. He had heard about her before, a bitter woman with too much free time and not enough kindness. Charles was already grabbing his keys. Mom, I'm on my way. Jamal and Malik stood frozen as the police car slowed to a stop. The red and blue lights flashed against their dark skin, making their small faces look even paler. Miss Loretta clenched her jaw as she stepped off the porch again, standing firmly by her grandsons. Karen smirked, folding her arms like she had just won something. Took you long enough, she huffed as two officers stepped out of the vehicle. Officer Daniels adjusted his belt as he approached. He was an older man with graying hair and tired eyes. His partner, Officer Reed, was younger, fresh-faced, the kind who still believed in following the rules, even when the rules were wrong. Daniels gave the boys a once-over, then looked at Karen. Ma'am, what exactly seems to be the issue here? Karen scoffed. They're loitering. They shouldn't be playing here, and I wouldn't be surprised if they stole something. Just look at them. Miss Loretta's hand tightened around Malik's shoulder. They were doing nothing but playing soccer. Her voice was like steel. And they don't need your permission to be here. Officer Reed hesitated, shifting on his feet. Ma'am, did you actually witness them taking anything? Karen rolled her eyes. You really think they'd do it while I was watching? Daniels let out a slow breath and turned to the boys. All right, son, he said to Jamal, lowering his voice slightly. Did you take anything? Do you have anything that doesn't belong to you? Jamal's face burned with frustration. He shouldn't have to prove his innocence, but he also knew how things worked. He shook his head. No, sir. Malik, who had been gripping his brother's shirt tightly, echoed, We didn't take nothing. Daniel studied them for a moment, then sighed. All right, well. But before he could finish, the sound of tires screeching against pavement made everyone turn. A sleek black car had pulled up aggressively, and the door flew open before it had even come to a full stop. Mayor Charles Carter stepped out. His presence alone changed the air around them. Karen's smirk faded. Daniel stiffened. Jamal and Malik exhaled all at once, because their father was here. And he looked furious. Mayor Charles Carter's polished shoes hit the pavement with force, his long strides cutting across the lawn like a blade. His jaw was clenched so tight it looked like it could crack. The moment his sons came into view, standing there, small and afraid, surrounded by cops, something deep inside him snapped. Karen Matthews stiffened, her usual arrogance flickering as Charles's sharp gaze landed on her. She took a small step back, as if suddenly realizing she had made a mistake. Officer Daniels straightened immediately, recognizing the man before him. Mayor Carter. But Charles wasn't looking at him. He was looking at his sons. Jamal and Malik stood frozen in place, their little faces unreadable, but he knew them too well. Jamal's clenched fists, Malik's wide, fearful eyes. They were holding it together, but they shouldn't have to. Loretta stepped forward, her eyes blazing. Charles, they were just playing, she said, her voice shaking with barely restrained fury. That woman called the cops on them for nothing. Karen let out a nervous laugh. Nothing? Well, excuse me for caring about safety in this neighborhood. Charles turned his full attention to her, and she fell silent. You called the police on two little boys. His voice was quiet, but it carried weight. Karen swallowed, her gaze darting toward the officers for backup. Daniels and Reed, however, looked distinctly uncomfortable now. They were loitering, Karen insisted, and who knows what they could have done. Charles took a step closer. They are my sons. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. That realization hit her like a slap. The mayor's sons. She had called the police on the mayor's sons. Jamal, standing beside his father now, finally spoke up. His voice was soft but clear. Dad, we didn't do anything. We told her that, but she wouldn't let us leave. Charles turned back to the officers. Do you have any evidence that my children committed a crime? Daniel shook his head, clearing his throat. No, sir, it doesn't appear that way. Then why? Charles demanded. Are we still standing here? Officer Reed glanced at his partner, then exhaled. We'll be on our way, sir. Karen's face burned red. Wait, you're just going to let them go? Daniels turned to her with a tired expression. Ma'am, there is no crime. There was no need to call us. Karen sputtered, her lips twisting like she wanted to argue, but she had lost control of the situation. The officers were already walking back to their squad car. She turned back to Charles, trying to salvage her power. Well, I was just looking out for the community. You people always... Choose your next words carefully, Karen. Charles's voice was a warning, and for the first time, Karen Matthews was afraid. Loretta crossed her arms, smirking. You better get inside, Karen, before you embarrass yourself even more. Karen hesitated. Then, with a huff, she spun on her heel and stormed back toward her house. But everyone knew she had lost. Jamal and Malik finally exhaled. Their father turned to them, kneeling down so they were eye level. You okay? Malik hesitated, then nodded. Yeah. But Jamal's jaw was tight. Why did she do that, Dad? Charles sighed, running a hand over his face. Because some people see your skin before they see you. Jamal frowned, letting those words settle. Malik just hugged his father. Charles held them close. But listen to me. You are not criminals. You are not troublemakers. You are my sons. And no one gets to make you feel small. Miss Loretta smiled proudly as Charles stood, placing a protective arm around his boys. Together, they walked back toward the house, leaving Karen Matthews standing alone watching. And for the first time, she was the one who felt out of place. The evening sun hung low in the sky as Charles Carter guided his sons inside their grandmother's house. The moment the door shut behind them, the tension in the air seemed to break. Loretta let out a heavy breath and shook her head. That woman had the nerve to try and keep them there until the cops arrived, my grandbabies. Charles rubbed his temples, his fury still simmering beneath his skin. He had dealt with racism his whole life, but seeing it aimed at his children? That was an entirely different kind of pain. Malik climbed onto the couch, fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. Why does she hate us? His small voice cut through the room. Charles sighed, taking a seat beside him. Some people, he said carefully, have been taught to fear or look down on others just because they're different, and when no one teaches them better, they believe it's okay to treat people unfairly. Jamal sat on the other side of his father, his arms still crossed. He was 10 now, old enough to start understanding the world in a way that hurt. But we didn't do anything wrong, he muttered. I know, son. Charles placed a hand on his shoulder, and that's the hardest part. Loretta crossed the room and sat across from them. It's not fair, but don't you dare let people like Karen Matthews make you feel less than who you are. You come from strength, from a family that's built this city up, not torn it down. She lifted her chin. Your father is the mayor, for goodness sake. Jamal huffed. She didn't care about that before. She does now, Charles said firmly. And she would care even more soon. The next morning, Karen Matthews woke up expecting the day to go on as usual. She had convinced herself that nothing would come of what happened yesterday. But the moment she checked her phone, reality hit her like a slap. Her name was everywhere. Her real name wasn't even in the headlines. Just her new title, Racist Woman Calls Cops on Mayor's Sons Over Playing in a Park. She scrolled down, her mouth falling open as she saw the pictures. Charles Carter arriving, his boys looking scared, the officers backing off. The entire neighborhood was talking about it. Some people were furious at her. Others tried to defend her. She was just looking out for the community. But the damage was done. The worst part? She was getting calls. From her job, from the HOA, even from people she used to be friends with who suddenly didn't want to be associated with her anymore. Karen clenched her phone, her pulse racing. How did this happen so fast? Then, as if the universe was rubbing salt in her wound, her TV lit up with a breaking news segment. And there he was, Mayor Charles Carter. standing in front of City Hall, speaking into microphones, his voice steady but firm. "We talk about making this city a place of equality," he said. "But what happened yesterday is a reminder that we still have a long way to go. No child should be made to feel like a criminal simply for playing outside. And it's time we hold people accountable for their actions." Karen's stomach twisted. Accountable. Charles wasn't just brushing this off, he was making it a lesson. And she was the example. Karen Matthews spent the entire morning pacing her living room, her heart pounding like a war drum. The coffee in her mug had gone cold, untouched, as she scrolled through social media. It was everywhere. Hundreds of comments, thousands of shares. The neighbors were talking about it. The entire city was talking about it. And the worst part, her boss had called. "Karen, we need to talk about this situation," Mr. Holloway had said, his voice strained. "Your name is circulating for all the wrong reasons. We can't afford this kind of attention." She had protested, begged even, but the decision was already made. Effective immediately, she was placed on an indefinite leave of absence. Her face burned with humiliation. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had only done what she thought was right, hadn't she? Meanwhile, across town, Charles Carter sat at his desk, his phone buzzing nonstop. Calls from community leaders, journalists, even civil rights activists who wanted to turn this into a larger conversation about racial profiling. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. This wasn't just about Karen Matthews. It was about his sons. Jamal and Malik had been forced to face a reality that no child should have to. They had been scared, humiliated, treated like suspects in a place where they should have felt safe. And he couldn't let that slide. A knock at his office door pulled him from his thoughts. His assistant peeked in. "Sir, the chief of police is here." Charles nodded. "Send him in." A moment later, Police Chief Warren Brooks stepped inside. A large, burly man with salt and pepper hair, he carried the weight of decades of law enforcement experience on his shoulders. He didn't waste time. "Mr. Mayor, I want to personally apologize for what happened to your boys." Charles raised an eyebrow. "Apologies are nice, Chief. Action is better." Brooks exhaled, nodding. "I agree. That's why we're launching a full internal review on how calls like this are handled. We don't want our officers being used as weapons by people with personal biases." Charles studied the man carefully. He wasn't just saying this for show. He meant it. Good. Because if there was one thing Charles Carter knew how to do, it was push for real change. The neighborhood reaction. By the afternoon, Karen Matthews was forced to do something she had never done before. She avoided going outside. The very neighborhood she had once felt entitled to control was now filled with people who looked at her differently. Some with disgust, others with disappointment. But the worst, the ones who ignored her completely. She saw her neighbor, Mr. Patel, watering his lawn. He usually waved. Today, he didn't even look in her direction. She saw young mothers chatting by the mailboxes, the same women she used to gossip with. Now, they hushed their voices when she walked by. She hurried back inside, slamming the door behind her. For the first time in a long time, Karen Matthews felt unwelcome, and she hated it. Karen Matthews sat at her kitchen table, gripping her phone with white-knuckled fingers. The news coverage hadn't stopped. The messages kept coming, some angry, some mocking, but the worst ones were from people she once considered friends. "Karen, I can't be associated with this kind of thing. You really messed up this time. Maybe you should move." The words burned. How had everything spiraled out of control so fast? The answer was simple. She had been exposed. Her real self, the part she had always managed to keep hidden beneath polite smiles and shallow pleasantries, had been laid bare for the entire city to see. And now, she was paying for it. Meanwhile, at City Hall, Charles Carter stepped up to the podium, his son standing beside him. The press conference had been hastily arranged, but the room was packed. He looked out over the crowd, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about his boys anymore. It was bigger than them. Clearing his throat, he spoke. "What happened to my children is something no child should ever experience. They were playing outside, just like kids do, when they were treated like criminals. And why? Because someone saw their skin before they saw their innocence." The room was silent, hanging on his every word. Racial profiling is not just a national issue. It happens right here, in our neighborhoods, in our schools, in our parks. It happens when people think they have the right to decide who belongs and who doesn't. He turned to Malik and Jamal, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. I refuse to let my sons grow up in a world where they have to apologize for simply existing. A murmur rippled through the crowd, supportive, somber. Charles straightened. Change starts here, and it starts now. A knock at the door that evening. There was a knock on Loretta's front door. When she opened it, she was not expecting to see Karen Matthews standing there. The woman looked exhausted. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed as if she hadn't slept. She clutched her purse tightly, like it was the only thing holding her together. Karen hesitated, swallowing hard. I wanted to say I'm sorry. Loretta crossed her arms. Sorry for what exactly? Karen exhaled shakily. For calling the cops, for assuming the worst about your grandkids, she sighed, looking down, for being the kind of person I never thought I was. Loretta studied her for a long moment. You didn't think you were racist, did you? Karen flinched. I just thought I was, being cautious. Loretta scoffed. Funny how you only get cautious around black children. Plenty of white kids play there all the time, but you never called the cops on them. Karen had no response.